Chapter 9 of Industrial Biography, Ironworkers and Toolmakers by Samuel Smiles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. The Invention of the Hot Blast, James Beaumont Neilson. Whilst the exploits of the conqueror and the intrigues of the demagogue are faithfully preserved through a succession of ages, the persevering and unobtrusive efforts of genius, developing the best blessings of the deity to man, are often consigned to oblivion. David Mushet. The extraordinary value of the Black Band ironstone was not at first duly recognised, perhaps not even by Mr. Mushet himself. For several years after its discovery by him, its use was confined to the Calder Iron Works, where it was employed in mixture with other ironstones of the argillaceous class. It was afterwards partially used at the Clyde Iron Works, but nowhere else, a strong feeling of prejudice being entertained against it on the part of the iron trade generally. It was not until the year 1825 that the Monkland Company used it alone, without any other mixture than the necessary quantity of limestone for a flux. The success of this company, says Mr. Mushet, soon gave rise to the Gartsherrie and Dundyvan furnaces, in the midst of which progress came the use of raw pit coal and the hot blast, the latter one of the greatest discoveries in metallurgy of the present age, and above every other process admirably adapted for the smelting of the Black Band ironstone. From the introduction of this process the extraordinary development of the iron manufacture of Scotland may be said to date, and we accordingly propose to devote the present chapter to an account of its meritorious inventor. James Beaumont Neilson was born at Shettleston, a roadside village about 3 miles eastward of Glasgow, on the 22nd of June 1792. His parents belonged to the working class. His father's earnings during many laborious years of his life did not exceed 16 shillings a week. He had been bred to the trade of a millwright, and was for some time in the employment of Dr. Roebuck as an engine wright at his colliery near Boroughstoness. He was next employed in a like capacity by Mr. Beaumont, the mineral manager of the collieries of Mrs. Cunningham of Laneshaw, near Irvine in Ayrshire, after which he was appointed engine wright at Ayr, and subsequently at the Govan Coal Works near Glasgow, where he remained until his death. It was while working at the Irvine Works that he first became acquainted with his future wife, Marion Smith, the daughter of a Renfrewshire bleacher, a woman remarkable through her life for her clever, managing, and industrious habits. She had the charge of Mrs. Cunningham's children for some time after the marriage of that lady to Mr. Beaumont, and it was in compliment to her former mistress and her husband that she named her youngest son James Beaumont after the latter. The boy's education was confined to the common elements of reading, writing, and arithmetic, which he partly acquired at the parish school of Strathbungo near Glasgow, and partly at the chapel school, as it was called, in the Gorbals at Glasgow. He had finally left school before he was 14. Some time before he left, he had been partially set to work, and earned 4 shillings a week by employing part of each day in driving a small condensing engine, which his father had put up in a neighbouring quarry. After leaving school, he was employed for 2 years as a gig boy on one of the winding engines at the Govan Colliery. His parents now considered him of fit age to be apprenticed to some special trade, and as Beaumont had much of his father's taste for mechanical pursuits, he was determined to put him apprentice to a working engineer. His elder brother John was then acting as engineman at Oakbank near Glasgow, and Beaumont was apprenticed under him to learn the trade. John was a person of a studious and serious turn of mind, and had been strongly attracted to follow the example of the brothers Haldane, who were then exciting great interest by their preaching throughout the north. But his father had set his face against his son's preaching at the back o' dykes, as he called it, and so John quietly settled down to his work. The engine which the two brothers managed was very small, and the master and apprentice served for engineman and fireman. Here the youth worked for 3 years, employing his leisure hours in the evenings in remedying the defects of his early education, and endeavouring to acquire a knowledge of English grammar, drawing, and mathematics. On the expiry of his apprenticeship, Beaumont continued for a time to work under his brother as a journeyman at a guinea a week, after which, in 1814, he entered the employment of William Taylor, coalmaster at Irvine, and he was appointed engine wright of the colliery at a salary of from £70 to £80 a year. One of the improvements which he introduced in the working of the colliery while he held that office was the laying down of an edge railway of cast iron, in lengths of 3 feet, from the pit to the harbour of Irvine, a distance of 3 miles. At the age of 23 he married his first wife, Barbara Montgomery, an Irvine lass with a tochter of £250. This little provision was all the more serviceable to him as, his master Taylor becoming unfortunate in business, he was suddenly thrown out of employment, and the little fortune enabled the newly married pair to hold their heads above water till better days came around. They took a humble tenement consisting of a room and a kitchen in the Cowcaddens, Glasgow, where their first child was born. About this time a gaswork, the first in Glasgow, was projected, and the company having been formed, the directors advertised for a superintendent and foreman, to whom they offered a liberal salary. Though Beaumont had never seen gaslight before, except at the illumination of his father's colliery office after the Peace of Amiens, which was accomplished in a very simple and original manner, without either condenser, purifier, or gas holder, and though he knew nothing of the art of gas making, he had the courage to apply for the situation. He was one of 20 candidates, and the fortunate one, and in August 1817 we find him appointed foreman of the Glasgow gasworks, for 5 years at the salary of £90 a year. Before the expiry of his term he was reappointed for 6 years more at the advanced salary of £200, with the status of manager and engineer of the works. His salary was gradually increased to £400 a year with free dwelling house until 1847, when, after a faithful service of 30 years, during which he had largely extended the central works and erected branch works at Tradeston and Partick, he finally resigned the management. The situation of manager of the Glasgow gasworks was in many respects well suited for the development of Mr. Neilson's peculiar abilities. In the first place, it afforded him facilities for obtaining theoretical as well as practical knowledge in chemical science, of which he was a diligent student at the Andersonian University, as well as of natural philosophy and mathematics in their higher branches. In the next place, it gave free scope for his ingenuity in introducing improvements in the manufacture of gas, then in its infancy. He was the first to employ clay retorts, and he introduced sulphate of iron as a self-acting purifier, passing the gas through beds of charcoal to remove its oily and tarry elements. The swallowtail or union jet was also his invention, and it has since come into general use. While managing the gasworks, one of Mr. Neilson's labours of love was the establishment and direction by him of a workmen's institution for mutual improvement. Having been a workman himself, and experienced the disadvantages of an imperfect education in early life, as well as the benefits arising from improved culture in later years, he desired to impart some of these advantages to the workmen in his employment, who consisted chiefly of persons from remoter parts of the Highlands or from Ireland. Most of them could not even read, and his principal difficulty consisted in persuading them that it was of any use to learn. For some time they resisted his persuasions to form a workmen's institution, with a view to the establishment of a library, classes, and lectures, urging as a sufficient plea for not joining it that they could not read, and that books would be of no use to them. At last Mr. Neilson succeeded, though with considerable difficulty, in inducing 14 of the workmen to adopt his plan. Each member was to contribute a small sum monthly, to be laid out in books, the gas company providing the members with a comfortable room in which they might read and converse in the evenings, instead of going to the alehouse. The members were afterwards allowed to take books home to read, and the room was used for the purpose of conversation on the subjects of the books read by them, and occasionally for lectures delivered by the members themselves on geography, arithmetic, chemistry, and mechanics. Their numbers increased so that the room in which they met became insufficient for their accommodation, when the gas company provided them with a new and larger place of meeting, together with a laboratory and workshop. In the former they studied practical chemistry, and in the latter they studied practical mechanics, making for themselves an air pump and an electrifying machine, as well as preparing the various models used in the course of the lectures. The effects on the workmen were eminently beneficial, and the institution came to be cited as amongst the most valuable of its kind in the kingdom. Mr. Neilson throughout watched carefully over its working, and exerted himself in all ways to promote its usefulness, in which he had the zealous co-operation of the leading workmen themselves and the gratitude of all. On the opening of the new and enlarged rooms in 1825, we find him delivering an admirable address, which was thought worthy of republication, together with the reply of George Sutherland, one of the workmen, in which Mr. Neilson's exertions as its founder and chief supporter were gratefully and forcibly expressed. It was during the period of his connection with the Glasgow gas works that Mr. Neilson directed his attention to the smelting of iron. His views in regard to the subject were at first somewhat crude, as appears from a paper read by him before the Glasgow Philosophical Society early in 1825. It appears that in the course of the preceding year his attention had been called to the subject by an ironmaker, who asked him if he thought it possible to purify the air blown into the blast furnace, in like manner as carburetted hydrogen gas was purified. The ironmaster supposed that it was the presence of sulphur in the air that caused blast furnaces to work irregularly, and to make bad iron in the summer months. Mr. Neilson was of opinion that this was not the true cause, and he was rather disposed to think it attributable to the want of a due proportion of oxygen in summer, when the air was more rarefied, besides containing more aqueous vapour than in winter. He therefore thought the true remedy was in some way or other to throw in a greater proportion of oxygen, and he suggested that, in order to dry the air, it should be passed on its way to the furnace through 2 long tunnels containing calcinated lime. But further inquiry served to correct his views, and eventually led him to the true theory of blasting. Shortly after, his attention was directed by Mr. James Ewing to a defect in one of the Muirkirk blast furnaces, situated about half a mile distant from the blowing engine, which was found not to work so well as others which were situated close to it. The circumstances of the case led Mr. Neilson to form the opinion that, as air increases in volume according to temperature, if he were to heat it by passing it through a red-hot vessel, its volume would be increased according to the well-known law, and the blast might thus be enabled to do more duty in the distant furnace. He proceeded to make a series of experiments at the gas works, trying the effect of heated air on the illuminating power of gas, by bringing up a stream of it in a tube so as to surround the gas burner. He found that by this means the combustion of the gas was rendered more intense, and its illuminating power greatly increased. He proceeded to try a similar experiment on a common smith's fire, by blowing the fire with heated air, and the effect was the same. The fire was much more brilliant, and was accompanied by an unusually intense degree of heat. Having obtained such marked results by these small experiments, it naturally occurred to him that a similar increase in intensity of combustion and temperature would attend the application of the process to the blast furnace on a large scale. But being only a gas maker, he had the greatest difficulty in persuading any ironmaster to permit him to make the necessary experiments with blast furnaces actually at work. Besides, his theory was altogether at variance with the established practice, which was to supply the air as cold as possible, the prevailing idea being that the coldness of the air in winter was the cause of the best iron being then produced. Acting on these views, the efforts of the ironmasters had always been directed to the cooling of the blast, and various expedients were devised for the purpose. Thus the regulator was painted white, as being the coolest colour. The air was passed over cold water, and in some cases the air pipes were even surrounded by ice, all with the object of keeping the blast cold. When, therefore, Mr. Neilson proposed entirely to reverse the process, and to employ hot instead of cold blast, the incredulity of the ironmasters may well be imagined. What! Neilson, a mere maker of gas, undertake to instruct practical men in the manufacture of iron, and to suppose that heated air can be used for the purpose! It was presumption in the extreme, or at best the mere visionary idea of a person altogether unacquainted with the subject. At length, however, Mr. Neilson succeeded in inducing Mr. Charles Mackintosh of Crossbasket, and Mr. Colin Dunlop of the Clyde Ironworks, to allow him to make a trial of the hot air process. In the first imperfect attempts, the air was heated to little more than 80 degrees Fahrenheit, yet the results were satisfactory, and the scoriae from the furnace evidently contained less iron. He was therefore desirous of trying his plan upon a more extensive scale, with the object, if possible, of thoroughly establishing the soundness of his principle. In this he was a good deal hampered, even by those ironmasters who were his friends, and had promised him the requisite opportunities for making a fair trial of the new process. They strongly objected to his making the necessary alterations in the furnaces, and he seemed to be as far from a satisfactory experiment as ever. In one instance, where he had so far succeeded as to be allowed to heat the blast main, he asked permission to introduce deflecting plates in the main, or to put a bend in the pipe, so as to bring the blast more closely against the heated sides of the pipe, and also increase the area of the heating surface, in order to raise the temperature to a higher point. But this was refused, and it was said that if even a bend were put in the pipe, the furnaces would stop working. These prejudices proved a serious difficulty in the way of our inventor, and several more years passed before he was allowed to put a bend in the blast main. After many years of perseverance, he was, however, at length enabled to work out his plan into a definite shape at the Clyde Ironworks, and its practical value was at once admitted. At the meeting of the Mechanical Engineers' Society held in May 1859, Mr. Neilson explained that his invention consisted solely in the principle of heating the blast between the engine and the furnace, and was not associated with any particular construction of the intermediate heating apparatus. This, he said, was the cause of its success, and in some respects it resembled the invention of his countryman James Watt, who in connection with a steam engine invented the plan of condensing the steam in a separate vessel, and was successful in maintaining his invention by not limiting it to any particular construction of the condenser. On the same occasion he took the opportunity of acknowledging the firmness with which the English ironmasters had stood by him when attempts were made to deprive him of the benefits of his invention, and to them he acknowledged he was mainly indebted for the successful issue of the severe contests he had to undergo. For there were, of course, certain of the ironmasters, both English and Scotch, supporters of the cause of free trade in others' inventions, who sought to resist the patent after it had come into general use and had been recognised as one of the most valuable improvements of modern times. The patent was secured in 1828 for a term of 14 years. But as Mr. Neilson did not himself possess the requisite capital to enable him to perfect the invention, or to defend it if attacked, he found it necessary to invite other gentlemen able to support him in these respects to share in its profits, retaining for himself only 3/10 of the whole. His partners were Mr. Charles Mackintosh, Mr. Colin Dunlop, and Mr. John Wilson of Dundyvan. The charge made by them was only $1 a ton for all iron produced by the new process, this low rate being fixed in order to ensure the introduction of the patent into general use, as well as to reduce to a minimum the temptations of the ironmasters to infringe it. The first trials of the process were made at the blast furnaces of Clyde and Calder, from whence the use of the hot blast gradually extended to the other iron mining districts. In the course of a few years, every furnace in Scotland, with one exception, that at Carron, had adopted the improvement, while it was also employed in half the furnaces of England and Wales, and in many of the furnaces on the Continent and in America. In the course of time, and with increasing experience, various improvements were introduced in the process, more particularly in the shape of the air-heating vessels, the last form adopted being that of a congery of tubes, similar to the tubular arrangement in the boiler of a locomotive, by which the greatest extent of heating surface was provided for the thorough heating of the air. By these modifications, the temperature of the air introduced into the furnace has been raised from 240 degrees to 600 degrees, or the temperature of melting lead. To protect the nozzle of the air pipe as it entered the furnace against the action of the intense heat to which it was subjected, a spiral pipe for a stream of cold water constantly to play in has been introduced within the sides of the iron tuyere through which the nozzle passes, by which means the tuyere is kept comparatively cool, while the nozzle of the air pipe is effectually protected. This valuable invention did not escape the usual fate of successful patents, and it was on several occasions the subject of protracted litigation. The first action occurred in 1832, but the objectors shortly gave in and renewed their licence. In 1839, when the process had become generally adopted throughout Scotland, and was indeed found absolutely essential for smelting the peculiar ores of that country, more especially Mushet's Black Band, a powerful combination was formed amongst the ironmasters to resist the patent. The litigation which ensued extended over 5 years, during which period some 20 actions were proceeding in Scotland, and several in England. 3 juries sat upon the subject at different times, and upon 3 occasions appeals were carried to the House of Lords. One jury trial occupied 10 days, during which 102 witnesses were examined, the law costs on both sides amounting, it is supposed, to at least £40,000. The result was that the novelty and merit of Mr. Neilson's invention were finally established, and he was secured in the enjoyment of the patent right. We are gratified to add that though Mr. Neilson had to part with 2/3 of the profits of the invention to secure the capital and influence necessary to bring it into general use, he realized sufficient to enable him to enjoy the evening of his life in peace and comfort. He retired from active business to an estate which he purchased in 1851 in the stewartry of Kirkcudbright, where he is found ready to lend a hand in every good work, whether in agricultural improvement, railway extension, or the moral and social good of those about him. Mindful of the success of his workmen's institution at the Glasgow gasworks, he has, almost at his own door, erected a similar institution for the use of the parish in which his property is situated, the beneficial effects of which have been very marked in the district. We may add that Mr. Neilson's merits have been recognised by many eminent bodies, by the Institution of Civil Engineers, the Chemical Society, and others, the last honour conferred on him being his election as a member of the Royal Society in 1846. The invention of the hot blast, in conjunction with the discovery of the Black Band ironstone, has had an extraordinary effect upon the development of the iron manufacture of Scotland. The coals of that country are generally unfit for coking, and lose as much as 55% in the process. But by using the hot blast, the coal could be sent to the blast furnace in its raw state, by which a large saving of fuel was effected. Even coals of an inferior quality were by its means made available for the manufacture of iron. But one of the peculiar qualities of the Black Band ironstone is that, in many cases, it contains sufficient coaly matter for purposes of calcination, without any admixture of coal whatever. Before its discovery, all the iron manufactured in Scotland was made from clayband, but the use of the latter has in a great measure been discontinued wherever a sufficient supply of Black Band can be obtained, and it is found to exist very extensively in most of the Midland Scotch counties, the coal and iron measures stretching in a broad belt from the Firth of Forth to the Irish Channel at the Firth of Clyde. At the time when the hot blast was invented, the fortunes of many of the older works were at a low ebb, and several of them had been discontinued, but they were speedily brought back to life again wherever Black Band could be found. In 1829, the year after Neilson's patent was taken out, the total make of Scotland was 29,000 tons. As fresh discoveries of the mineral were made, in Ayrshire and Lanarkshire, new works were erected, until in 1845 we find the production of Scotch pig iron had increased to 475,000 tons. It has since increased to upwards of 1,000,000 of tons, 19/20ths of which are made from Black Band ironstone. Employment has thus been given to vast numbers of our industrial population, and the wealth and resources of the Scotch iron districts have been increased to an extraordinary extent. During the last year there were 125 furnaces in blast throughout Scotland, each employing about 400 men in making an average of 200 tons a week, and the money distributed among the workmen may readily be computed from the fact that under the most favourable circumstances the cost of making iron in wages alone amounts to 36 shillings a ton. An immense additional value was given to all land in which Black Band was found. Mr. Mushet mentions that in 1839 the proprietor of the Airdrie estate derived a royalty of £16,500 from the mineral, which had not before its discovery yielded him 1 farthing. At the same time many fortunes have been made by pushing and energetic men who have of late years entered upon this new branch of industry. Amongst these may be mentioned the Bairds of Gartsherry, who vie with the Guests and Crawshays of South Wales, and have advanced themselves in the course of a very few years from the station of small farmers to that of great capitalists, owning estates in many counties, holding the highest character of commercial men, and ranking among the largest employers of labour in the kingdom. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10 of Industrial Biography, Ironworkers and Toolmakers, by Samuel Smiles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Mechanical Inventions and Inventors. L'invention n'est-elle pas la poésie de la science? Toutes les grandes découvertes portent avec elles la trace ineffaçable d'une pensée poétique. Il faut être poète pour créer. Aussi, sommes-nous convaincus que si les puissantes machines, véritables sources de la production et de l'industrie de nos jours, doivent recevoir des modifications radicales, ce sera à des hommes d'imagination, et non point à des hommes purement spécieux, que l'on devra cette transformation. I.M. Bataille traite des machines à vapeur. Tools have played a highly important part in the history of civilization. Without tools and the ability to use them, man were indeed but a poor bare-forked animal, worse clothed than the birds, worse housed than the beaver, worse fed than the jackal. Weak in himself, says Carlyle, and of small stature, he stands on a basis, at most for the flattest soled of some half square foot, insecurely enough, has to straddle out his legs lest the very wind supplant him. Feeblest of bipeds, 3 quintals are a crushing load for him. The steer of the meadow tosses him aloft like a waste rag. Nevertheless, he can use tools, can devise tools. With these the granite mountain melts into light dust before him. He kneads glowing iron as if it were soft paste. Seas are his smooth highway, winds and fire his unvarying steeds. Nowhere do you find him without tools. Without tools he is nothing. With tools he is all. His very first contrivances to support life were tools of the simplest and rudest construction, and his latest achievements in the substitution of machinery for the relief of the human hand and intellect are founded on the use of tools of a still higher order. Hence it is not without good reason that man has, by some philosophers, been defined as a tool-making animal. Tools, like everything else, had small beginnings. With the primitive stone hammer and chisel very little could be done. The felling of a tree would occupy a workman a month unless helped by the destructive action of fire. Dwellings could not be built, the soil could not be tilled, clothes could not be fashioned and made, and the hewing out of a boat was so tedious a process that wood must have been far gone into decay before it could be launched. It was a great step in advance to discover the art of working in metals, more especially in steel, one of the few metals capable of taking a sharp edge and keeping it. From the date of this discovery, working in wood and stone would be found comparatively easy, and the results must speedily have been felt not only in the improvement of man's daily food, but in his domestic and social condition. Clothing could then be made, the primitive forest could be cleared and tillage carried out. Abundant fuel could be obtained, dwellings erected, ships built, temples reared. Every improvement in tools marking a new step in the development of the human intellect and a further stage in the progress of human civilization. The earliest tools were of the simplest possible character, consisting principally of modifications of the wedge, such as the knife, the shears, formed of two knives working on a joint, the chisel and the axe. These, with the primitive hammer, formed the principal stock in trade of the early mechanics, who were handicraftsmen in the literal sense of the word. But the work which the early craftsmen in wood, stone, brass, and iron contrived to execute sufficed to show how much expertness in the handling of tools will serve to compensate for their mechanical imperfections. Workmen then sought rather to aid muscular strength than to supersede it, and mainly to facilitate the efforts of manual skill. Another tool became added to those mentioned above, which proved an additional source of power to the workman. We mean the saw, which was considered of so much importance that its inventor was honoured with a place among the gods in the mythology of the Greeks. This invention is said to have been suggested by the arrangement of the teeth in the jaw of a serpent, used by Talus, the nephew of Daedalus, in dividing a piece of wood. From the representations of ancient tools found in the paintings at Herculaneum, it appears that the frame saw used by the ancients very nearly resembled that still in use, and we are informed that the tools employed in the carpenters' shops at Nazareth at this day are in most respects the same as those represented in the buried Roman city. Another very ancient tool referred to in the Bible and in Homer was the file, which was used to sharpen weapons and implements. Thus the Hebrews had a file for the mattocks and for the coulters, and for the forks and for the axes, and to sharpen the goads. When to these we add the adze, plane irons, the auger, and the chisel, we sum up the tools principally relied on by the early mechanics for working in wood and iron. Such continue to be the chief tools in use down almost to our own day. The smith was at first the principal tool maker, but special branches of trade were gradually established devoted to tool making. So long, however, as the workman relied mainly on his dexterity of hand, the amount of production was comparatively limited, for the number of skilled workmen was but small. The articles turned out by them, being the product of tedious manual labour, were too dear to come into common use, and were made almost exclusively for the richer classes of the community. It was not until machinery had been invented and had become generally adopted that many of the ordinary articles of necessity and of comfort were produced in sufficient abundance and at such prices as enabled them to enter into the consumption of the great body of the people. But every improver of tools had a long and difficult battle to fight, for any improvement in their effective power was sure to touch the interests of some established craft. Especially was this the case with machines, which are but tools of a more complete though complicated kind than those above described. Take, for instance, the case of the saw. The tedious drudgery of dividing timber by the old-fashioned handsaw is well known. To avoid it, some ingenious person suggested that a number of saws should be fixed to a frame in a mill, so contrived as to work with a reciprocating motion, upwards and downwards, or backwards and forwards, and that this frame so mounted should be yoked to the mill wheel, and the saws driven by the power of wind or water. The plan was tried, and, as may readily be imagined, the amount of effective work done by this machine saw was immense compared with the tedious process of sawing by hand. It will be observed, however, that the new method must have seriously interfered with the labour of the hand sawyers, and it was but natural that they should regard the establishment of the sawmills with suspicion and hostility. Hence a long period elapsed before the hand sawyers would permit the new machinery to be set up and worked. The first sawmill in England was erected by a Dutchman near London in 1663, but was shortly abandoned in consequence of the determined hostility of the workmen. More than a century passed before a second sawmill was set up, when, in 1767, Mr. John Houghton, a London timber merchant, by the desire and with the approbation of the Society of Arts, erected one at Limehouse, to be driven by wind. The work was directed by one James Stansfield, who had gone over to Holland for the purpose of learning the art of constructing and managing the sawing machinery. But the mill was no sooner erected than a mob assembled and razed it to the ground. The principal rioters having been punished, and the loss to the proprietor having been made good by the nation, a new mill was shortly after built, and it was suffered to work without further molestation. Improved methods of manufacture have usually had to encounter the same kind of opposition. Thus, when the Flemish weavers came over to England in the 17th century, bringing with them their skill and their industry, they excited great jealousy and hostility among the native workmen. Their competition as workmen was resented as an injury, but their improved machinery was regarded as a far greater source of mischief. In a memorial presented to the King in 1621, we find the London weavers complaining of the foreigners' competition, but especially that they have made so bold of late as to devise engines for working of tape, lace, ribbon, and such like, wherein one man doth more among them than 7 Englishmen can do, so as their cheap sale of commodity beggareth all our English artificers of the trade, and enricheth them. At a much more recent period, new inventions have had to encounter serious rioting and machine-breaking fury. Kay of the fly shuttle, Hargreaves of the spinning jenny, and Arkwright of the spinning frame, all had to fly from Lancashire, glad to escape with their lives. Indeed, says Mr. Bazley, so jealous were the people, and also the legislature, of everything calculated to supersede men's labour, that when the Sankey Canal, 6 miles long, near Warrington, was authorized about the middle of last century, it was on the express condition that the boats plying along it should be drawn by men only. Even improved agricultural tools and machines have had the same opposition to encounter, and in our own time bands of rural labourers have gone from farm to farm, breaking drill ploughs, winnowing, threshing, and other machines, down even to the common drills, not perceiving that if their policy had proved successful, and tools could have been effectually destroyed, the human race would at once have been reduced to their teeth and nails, and civilization summarily abolished. It is no doubt natural that the ordinary class of workmen should regard with prejudice, if not with hostility, the introduction of machines calculated to place them at a disadvantage and to interfere with their usual employments. For to poor and not very far-seeing men, the loss of daily bread is an appalling prospect. But invention does not stand still on that account. Human brains will work. Old tools are improved and new ones invented, superseding existing methods of production, though the weak and unskilled may occasionally be pushed aside or even trodden underfoot. The consolation which remains is that, while the few suffer, society as a whole is vastly benefited by the improved methods of production, which are suggested, invented, and perfected by the experience of successive generations. The living race is the inheritor of the industry and skill of all past times, and the civilization we enjoy is but the sum of the useful effects of labour during the past centuries. Nihil per saltum. By slow and often painful steps, nature's secrets have been mastered. Not an effort has been made but has had its influence, for no human labour is altogether lost, some remnant of useful effect surviving for the benefit of the race, if not of the individual. Even attempts apparently useless have not really been so, but have served in some way to advance man to a higher knowledge, skill, or discipline. The loss of a position gained, says Professor Thomson, is an event unknown in the history of man's struggle with the forces of inanimate nature. A single step won gives a firmer foothold for further effort. The man may die, but the race survives and continues the work, to use the poet's simile, mounting on stepping stones of dead selves to higher selves. Philarete Charles, indeed, holds that it is the human race that is your true inventor. As if to unite all generations, he says, and to show that man can only act efficiently by association with others, it has been ordained that each inventor shall only interpret the first word of the problem he sets himself to solve, and that every great idea shall be the resume of the past at the same time as it is the germ of the future. And rarely does it happen that any discovery or invention of importance is made by one man alone. The threads of inquiry are taken up and traced, one labourer succeeding another, each tracing it a little further, often without apparent result. This goes on sometimes for centuries, until at length some man, perhaps greater than his fellows, seeking to fulfil the needs of his time, gathers the various threads together, treasures up the gain of past successes and failures, and uses them as the means for some solid achievement. Thus Newton discovered the laws of gravitation, and thus James Watt invented the steam engine. So also of the locomotive, of which Robert Stephenson said, "It has not been the invention of any one man, but of a race of mechanical engineers." Or as Joseph Bramah observed, in the preamble to his second lock patent, "Among the number of patents granted, there are comparatively few which can be called original, so that it is difficult to say where the boundary of one ends and where that of another begins." The arts are indeed reared but slowly, and it was a wise observation of Lord Bacon that we are too apt to pass those ladders by which they have been reached, and reflect the whole merit on the last new performer. Thus what is hailed as an original invention is often found to be but the result of a long succession of trials and experiments, gradually following each other, which ought rather to be considered as a continuous series of achievements of the human mind than as the conquest of any single individual. It has sometimes taken centuries of experience to ascertain the value of a single fact in its various bearings. Like man himself, experience is feeble and apparently purposeless in its infancy, but acquires maturity and strength with age. Experience, however, is not limited to a lifetime, but is the stored up wealth and power of our race. Even amidst the death of successive generations, it is constantly advancing and accumulating, exhibiting at the same time the weakness and the power, the littleness and the greatness of our common humanity. And not only do we who live succeed to the actual results of our predecessors' labour, to their works of learning and of art, their inventions and discoveries, their tools and machines, their roads, bridges, canals, and railways, but to the inborn aptitude of blood and brain which they bequeath to us, to that educability, so to speak, which has been won for us by the labour of many generations, and forms our richest natural heritage. The beginning of most inventions is very remote. The first idea, born within some unknown brain, passes thence into others, and at last comes forth complete, after a parturition, it may be, of centuries. One starts the idea, another develops it, and so on progressively until at last it is elaborated and worked out in practice. But the first, not less than the last, is entitled to his share in the merit of the invention, were it only possible to measure and apportion it duly. Sometimes a great original mind strikes upon some new vein of hidden power, and gives a powerful impulse to the inventive faculties of man, which lasts through generations. More frequently, however, inventions are not entirely new, but modifications of contrivances previously known, though to a few, and not yet brought into practical use. Glancing back over the history of mechanism, we occasionally see an invention seemingly full-born, when suddenly it drops out of sight, and we hear no more of it for centuries. It is taken up de novo by some inventor, stimulated by the needs of his time, and falling again upon the track, he recovers the old footmarks, follows them up, and completes the work. There is also such a thing as inventions being born before their time, the advanced mind of one generation projecting that which cannot be executed for want of the requisite means. But in due process of time, when mechanism has got abreast of the original idea, it is at length carried out. and thus it is that modern inventors are enabled to effect many objects which their predecessors had tried in vain to accomplish. As Louis Napoleon has said, "Inventions born before their time must remain useless until the level of common intellects rises to comprehend them." For this reason, misfortune is often the lot of the inventor before his time, though glory and profit may belong to his successors. Hence the gift of inventing not unfrequently involves a yoke of sorrow. Many of the greatest inventors have lived neglected and died unrequited before their merits could be recognised and estimated. Even if they succeed, they often raise up hosts of enemies in the persons whose methods they propose to supersede. Envy, malice, and detraction meet them in all their forms. They are assailed by combinations of rich and unscrupulous persons to wrest from them the profits of their ingenuity. And last, and worst of all, the successful inventor often finds his claim to originality decried, and himself branded as a copyist and a pirate. Among the inventions born out of time, and before the world could make adequate use of them, we can only find space to allude to a few, though they are so many that one is almost disposed to accept the words of Chaucer as true, that "there is nothing new but what has once been old," or, as another writer puts it, "there is nothing new but what has before been known and forgotten," or, in the words of Solomon, "the thing that hath been is that which shall be, and there is no new thing under the sun." One of the most important of these is the use of steam, which was well known to the ancients, but though it was used to grind drugs, to turn a spit, and to excite the wonder and fear of the credulous, a long time elapsed before it became employed as a useful motive power. The inquiries and experiments on the subject extended through many ages. Friar Bacon, who flourished in the 13th century, seems fully to have anticipated in the following remarkable passage nearly all that steam could accomplish, as well as the hydraulic engine and the diving bell, though the flying machine yet remains to be invented. "I will now," says the friar, "mention some of the wonderful works of art and nature in which there is nothing of magic, and which magic could not perform. Instruments may be made by which the largest ships, with only one man guiding them, will be carried with greater velocity than if they were full of sailors. Chariots may be constructed that will move with incredible rapidity without the help of animals. Instruments of flying may be formed, in which a man, sitting at his ease and meditating on any subject, may beat the air with his artificial wings, after the manner of birds. A small instrument may be made to raise or depress the greatest weights. An instrument may be fabricated by which one man may draw 1,000 men to him by force and against their will, as also machines which will enable men to walk at the bottom of seas or rivers without danger." It is possible that Friar Bacon derived his knowledge of the powers which he thus described from the traditions handed down of former inventions which had been neglected and allowed to fall into oblivion. For before the invention of printing, which enabled the results of investigations and experience to be treasured up in books, there was great risk of the inventions of one age being lost to the succeeding generations. Yet Disraeli the elder is of opinion that the Romans had invented printing without being aware of it, or perhaps the Senate dreaded the inconveniences attending its use, and did not care to deprive a large body of scribes of their employment. They even used stereotypes, or removable printing types, to stamp impressions on their pottery, specimens of which still exist. In China the art of printing is of great antiquity. Lithography was well known in Germany by the very name which it still bears, nearly 300 years before Sennenfelder reinvented it, and specimens of the ancient art are yet to be seen in the Royal Museum at Munich. Steam locomotion by sea and land had long been dreamt of and attempted. Blasco de Garay made his experiment in the harbour of Barcelona as early as 1543. Denis Papin made a similar attempt at Cassel in 1707. But it was not until Watt had solved the problem of the steam engine that the idea of the steamboat could be developed in practice, which was done by Miller of Dalswinton in 1788. Sages and poets have frequently foreshadowed inventions of great social moment. Thus Dr. Darwin's anticipation of the locomotive in his Botanic Garden, published in 1791, before any locomotive had been invented, might almost be regarded as prophetic. "Soon shall thy arm, unconquered steam, afar drag the slow barge and drive the rapid car." Denis Papin first threw out the idea of atmospheric locomotion, and Goethe, another Frenchman, in 1782, projected a method of conveying parcels and merchandise by subterraneous tubes, after the method recently patented and brought into operation by the London Pneumatic Dispatch Company. The balloon was an ancient Italian invention, revived by Montgolfier long after the original had been forgotten. Even the reaping machine is an old invention revived. Thus Barnaby Googe, the translator of a book from the German entitled The Whole Art and Trade of Husbandry, published in 1577 in the reign of Elizabeth, speaks of the reaping machine as a worn-out invention, a thing which was wont to be used in France. The device was a low kind of car, with a couple of wheels and a front armed with sharp sickles, which, forced by the beast through the corn, did cut all down before it. "This trick," says Googe, "might be used in level and champion countries, but with us it would make but ill-favoured work." The Thames Tunnel was thought an entirely new manifestation of engineering genius, but the tunnel under the Euphrates in ancient Babylon, and that under the wide mouth of the harbour at Marseilles, a much more difficult work, show that the ancients were beforehand with us in the art of tunnelling. Macadamised roads are as old as the Roman Empire, and suspension bridges, though comparatively new in Europe, have been known in China for centuries. There is every reason to believe, indeed it seems clear, that the Romans knew of gunpowder, though they only used it for the purpose of fireworks, while the secret of the destructive Greek fire has been lost altogether. When gunpowder came to be used for purposes of war, invention busied itself upon instruments of destruction. When recently examining the museum of the Arsenal at Venice, we were surprised to find numerous weapons of the 15th and 16th centuries embodying the most recent English improvements in arms, such as revolving pistols, rifled muskets, and breech-loading cannon. The latter, embodying Sir William Armstrong's modern idea, though in a rude form, had been fished up from the bottom of the Adriatic, where the ship armed with them had been sunk hundreds of years ago. Even Perkin's steam gun was an old invention revived by Leonardo da Vinci, and by him attributed to Archimedes. The Congreve rocket is said to have an Eastern origin, Sir William Congreve having observed its destructive effects when employed by the forces under Tipu Saib in the Maratha War, on which he adopted and improved the missile, and brought out the invention as his own. Coal gas was regularly used by the Chinese for lighting purposes long before it was known amongst us. Hydropathy was generally practised by the Romans, who established baths wherever they went. Even chloroform is no new thing. The use of ether as an anaesthetic was known to Albertus Magnus, who flourished in the 13th century, and in his works he gives a recipe for its preparation. In 1681 Denis Papin published his Traité des opérations sans douleur, showing that he had discovered methods of deadening pain. But the use of anaesthetics is much older than Albertus Magnus or Papin, for the ancients had their nepenthe and mandragora, the Chinese their mayo, and the Egyptians their hashish, both preparations of cannabis indica, the effects of which in a great measure resemble those of chloroform. What is perhaps still more surprising is the circumstance that one of the most elegant of recent inventions, that of sun painting by the daguerreotype, was in the 15th century known to Leonardo da Vinci, whose skill as an architect and engraver, and whose accomplishments as a chemist and natural philosopher, have been almost entirely overshadowed by his genius as a painter. The idea, thus early born, lay in oblivion until 1760, when the daguerreotype was again clearly indicated in a book published in Paris, written by a certain Tiphane de la Roche, under the anagrammatic title of Gifanti. Still later, at the beginning of the present century, we find Thomas Wedgwood, Sir Humphrey Davy, and James Watt making experiments on the action of light upon nitrate of silver; and only within the last few months a silvered copper plate has been found amongst the old household lumber of Matthew Boulton, Watt's partner, having on it a representation of the old premises at Soho, apparently taken by some such process. In like manner, the invention of the electric telegraph, supposed to be exclusively modern, was clearly indicated by Schwenter in his Délassement psychomathematique, published in 1636, and he there pointed out how two individuals could communicate with each other by means of the magnetic needle. A century later, in 1746, Le Monnier exhibited a series of experiments in the Royal Gardens at Paris, showing how electricity could be transmitted through iron wire 950 fathoms in length; and in 1753 we find one Charles Marshall publishing a remarkable description of the electric telegraph in the Scots Magazine, under the title of An Expedition's Method of Conveying Intelligence. Again, in 1760 we find George Louis Lesage, Professor of Mathematics at Geneva, promulgating his invention of an electric telegraph, which he eventually completed and set to work in 1774. This instrument was composed of 24 metallic wires, separated from each other and enclosed in a non-conducting substance. Each wire ended in a stalk, mounted with a little ball of elderwood suspended by a silk thread. When a stream of electricity, no matter how slight, was sent through the wire, the elder ball at the opposite end was repelled, such movement designating some letter of the alphabet. A few years later we find Arthur Young, in his Travels in France, describing a similar machine invented by M. Lemont of Paris, the action of which he also describes. In these and similar cases, though the idea was born and the model of the invention was actually made, it still waited the advent of the scientific mechanical inventor, who should bring it to perfection and embody it in a practical working form. Some of the most valuable inventions have descended to us without the names of their authors having been preserved. We are the inheritors of an immense legacy of the results of labour and ingenuity, but we know not the names of our benefactors. Who invented the watch as a measurer of time? Who invented the fast and loose pulley? Who invented the eccentric? Who, asks the mechanical inquirer, invented the method of cutting screws with stocks and dies? Whoever he may be, he was certainly a great benefactor of his species. Yet, adds the writer, his name is not known, though the invention has been so recent. This is not, however, the case with most modern inventions, the greater number of which are more or less disputed. Who was entitled to the merit of inventing printing has never yet been determined. Weber and Sennefelder both laid claim to the invention of lithography, though it was merely an old German art revived. Even the invention of the penny postage system by Sir Rowland Hill is disputed, Dr. Gray of the British Museum claiming to be its inventor, and a French writer alleging it to be an old French invention. The invention of the steamboat has been claimed on behalf of Blasco de Guéret, a Spaniard, Papin, a Frenchman, Jonathan Hulls, an Englishman, and Patrick Miller of Dalswinton, a Scotchman. The invention of the spinning machine has been variously attributed to Paul, Wyatt, Hargreaves, Higley, and Arkwright. The invention of the balance spring was claimed by Huygens, a Dutchman, Hautefeuille, a Frenchman, and Hooke, an Englishman. There is scarcely a point of detail in the locomotive but is the subject of dispute. Thus the invention of the blast pipe is claimed for Trevithick, George Stephenson, Goldsworthy Gurney, and Timothy Hackworth; that of the tubular boiler by Seguin, Stevens, Booth, and W. H. James; that of the link motion by John Gray, Hugh Williams, and Robert Stephenson. Indeed, many inventions appear to be coincident. A number of minds are working at the same time on the same track, with the object of supplying some want generally felt; and guided by the same experience, they not unfrequently arrive at like results. It has sometimes happened that the inventors have been separated by great distances, so that piracy on the part of either was impossible. Thus Hadley and Godfrey almost simultaneously invented the quadrant, one in London, the other in Philadelphia; and the process of electrotyping was invented at the same time by Mr. Spencer, a working chemist at Liverpool, and by Professor Jacobi at St. Petersburg. The safety lamp was a coincident invention made about the same time by Sir Humphry Davy and George Stephenson; And perhaps a still more remarkable instance of a coincident discovery was that of the planet Neptune, by Leverrier at Paris and by Adams at Cambridge. It is always difficult to apportion the due share of merit which belongs to mechanical inventors, who are accustomed to work upon each other's hints and suggestions as well as by their own experience. Some idea of this difficulty may be formed from the fact that, in the course of our investigations as to the origin of the planing machine, one of the most useful of modern tools, we have found that it has been claimed on behalf of 6 inventors: Fox of Derby, Roberts of Manchester, Matthew Murray of Leeds, Spring of Aberdeen, Clement and George Rennie of London. And there may be other claimants of whom we have not yet heard. But most mechanical inventions are of a very composite character, and are led up to by the labour and the study of a long succession of workers. Thus Savary and Newcomen led up to Watt, Cugnot, Murdoch and Trevithick to the Stephensons, Maudslay to Clement, Roberts, Nasmyth, Whitworth, and many more mechanical inventors. There is scarcely a process in the arts but has in like manner engaged mind after mind in bringing it to perfection. There is nothing, says Mr. Hawkshaw, really worth having that man has obtained, that has not been the result of a combined and gradual process of investigation. A gifted individual comes across some old footmark, stumbles on a chain of previous research and inquiry. He meets, for instance, with a machine, the result of much previous labour. He modifies it, pulls it to pieces, constructs and reconstructs it, and by further trial and experiment he arrives at the long sought for result. But the making of the invention is not the sole difficulty. It is one thing to invent, said Sir Mark Brunel, and another thing to make the invention work. Thus, when Watt, after long labour and study, had brought his invention to completion, he encountered an obstacle which had stood in the way of other inventors, and for a time prevented the introduction of their improvements, if not led to their being laid aside and abandoned. This was the circumstance that the machine projected was so much in advance of the mechanical capability of the age, that it was with the greatest difficulty it could be executed. When labouring upon his invention at Glasgow, Watt was baffled and thrown into despair by the clumsiness and incompetency of his workmen. Writing to Dr. Roebuck on one occasion, he said, "You ask what is the principal hindrance in erecting engines? It is always the smith work." His first cylinder was made by a whitesmith, of hammered iron soldered together. But having used quicksilver to keep the cylinder airtight, it dropped through the inequalities into the interior, and played the devil with the solder. Yet, inefficient though the whitesmith was, Watt could ill spare him, and we find him writing to Dr. Roebuck almost in despair, saying, "My old white iron man is dead," feeling his loss to be almost irreparable. His next cylinder was cast and bored at Carron, but it was so untrue that it proved next to useless. The piston could not be kept steam tight, notwithstanding the various expedients which were adopted of stuffing it with paper, cork, putty pasteboard, and old hat. Even after Watt had removed to Birmingham, and he had the assistance of Bolton's best workmen, Smeaton expressed the opinion, when he saw the engine at work, that notwithstanding the excellence of the invention, it could never be brought into general use because of the difficulty of getting its various parts manufactured with sufficient precision. For a long time we find Watt, in his letters, complaining to his partner of the failure of his engines through villainous bad workmanship. Sometimes the cylinders, when cast, were found to be more than 1/8 of an inch wider at one end than the other, and under such circumstances it was impossible the engine could act with precision. Yet better work could not be had. First-rate workmen in machinery did not as yet exist. They were only in process of education. Nearly everything had to be done by hand. The tools used were of a very imperfect kind. A few ill-constructed lathes, with some drills and boring machines of a rude sort, consisted the principal furniture of the workshop. Years after, when Brunel invented his block machines, considerable time elapsed before he could find competent mechanics to construct them, and even after they had been constructed he had equal difficulty in finding competent hands to work them. Watt endeavoured to remedy the defect by keeping certain sets of workmen to special classes of work, allowing them to do nothing else. Fathers were induced to bring up their sons at the same bench with themselves, and initiate them into the dexterity which they had acquired by experience. And at Soho it was not unusual for the same precise line of work to be followed by members of the same family for 3 generations. In this way, as great a degree of accuracy of a mechanical kind was arrived at as practicable under the circumstances. But notwithstanding all this care, accuracy of fitting could not be secured so long as the manufacture of steam engines was conducted mainly by hand. There was usually a considerable waste of steam, which the expedients of chewed paper and greased hat packed outside the piston was insufficient to remedy, and it was not until the invention of automatic machine tools by the mechanical engineers about to be mentioned that the manufacture of the steam engine became a matter of comparative ease and certainty. Watt was compelled to rest satisfied with imperfect results arising from imperfect workmanship. Thus, writing to Dr. Small respecting a cylinder 18 inches in diameter, he said, "At the worst place the long diameter exceeded the short by only 3/8 of an inch." How different from the state of things at this day, when a cylinder 5 feet wide will be rejected as a piece of imperfect workmanship if it be found to vary in any part more than the 80th part of an inch in diameter. Not 50 years since, it was a matter of the utmost difficulty to set an engine to work, sometimes of equal difficulty to keep it going. Though fitted by competent workmen, it often would not go at all. Then the foreman of the factory at which it was made was sent for, and he would almost live beside the engine for a month or more, and after easing her here and screwing her up there, putting in a new part and altering an old one, packing the piston and tightening the valves, the machine would at length be got to work. Now the case is altogether different. The perfection of modern machine tools is such that the utmost possible precision is secured, and the mechanical engineer can calculate on a degree of exactitude that does not admit of a deviation beyond the 1,000th part of an inch. When the powerful oscillating engines of the Warrior were put on board that ship, the parts, consisting of some 5,000 separate pieces, were brought from different workshops of the Messrs. Penn and Sons, where they had been made by workmen who knew not the places where they were to occupy, and fitted together with such precision that, so soon as the steam was raised and let into the cylinders, the immense machine began as if to breathe and move like a living creature, stretching its huge arms like a newborn giant, and then, after practising its strength a little, and proving its soundness in body and limb, it started off with the power of above 1,000 horses to try its strength in breasting the billows of the North Sea. Such are among the triumphs of modern mechanical engineering, due in a great measure to the perfection of the tools by means of which all works in metal are now fashioned. These tools are themselves among the most striking results of the mechanical invention of the day. They are automata of the most perfect kind, rendering the engine and machine maker in a great measure independent of inferior workmen. For the machine tools have no unsteady hand, are not careless nor clumsy, do not work by rule of thumb, and cannot make mistakes. They will repeat their operations 1,000 times without tiring or varying one hair's breadth in their action, and will turn out, without complaining, any quantity of work, all of like accuracy and finish. Exercising as they do so remarkable an influence on the development of modern industry, we now propose, so far as the materials at our disposal will admit, to give an account of their principal inventors, beginning with the school of Bramah. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11 of Industrial Biography, Ironworkers and Toolmakers, by Samuel Smiles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Clive Catterall. Joseph Bramah. The great inventor is one who has walked forth upon the industrial world not from universities but from hovels, not as clad in silks and decked with honours, but is clad in fustian and grimed with soot and oil. Isaac Taylor, Ultimate Civilization. The inventive faculty is so strong in some men that it may be said to amount to a passion, and cannot be restrained. The saying that the poet is born, not made, applies with equal force to the inventor, who, though indebted like the other to culture and improved opportunities, nevertheless invents and goes on inventing, mainly to gratify his own instinct. The inventor, however, is not a creator like the poet, but chiefly a finder-out. His power consists in a great measure in quick perception and accurate observation, and in seeing and foreseeing the effects of certain mechanical combinations. He must possess the gift of insight, as well as of manual dexterity, combined with the indispensable qualities of patience and perseverance. For though baffled as he often is, he must be ready to rise up again unconquered, even in the moment of defeat. This is the stuff of which the greatest inventors have been made. The subject of the following memoir may not be entitled to rank as a first-class inventor, though he was a most prolific one, but as the founder of a school from which proceeded some of the most distinguished mechanics of our time, he is entitled to a prominent place in this series of memoirs. Joseph Bramah was born in 1748 at the village of Stainborough, near Barnsley, in Yorkshire, where his father rented a small farm under Lord Strafford. Joseph was the eldest of 5 children, and was early destined to follow the plough. After receiving a small amount of education at the village school, he was set to work upon the farm. From an early period he showed signs of constructive skill. When a mere boy, he occupied his leisure hours in making musical instruments, and he succeeded in executing some creditable pieces of work with very imperfect tools. A violin, which was made out of a solid block of wood, was long preserved as a curiosity. He was so fortunate as to make a friend of the village blacksmith, whose smithy he was in the practice of frequenting. The smith was an ingenious workman, and having taken a liking for the boy, he made sundry tools for him out of old files and razor blades, and with these his fiddle and other pieces of work were mainly executed. Joseph might have remained a ploughman for life, but for an accident which happened to his right ankle at the age of 16, which unfitted him for farm work. While confined at home disabled, he spent his time in carving and making things in wood, and then it occurred to him that, though he could not be a ploughman, he might be a mechanic. When sufficiently recovered, he was, accordingly, put apprentice to one Allott, the village carpenter, under whom he soon became an expert workman. He could make ploughs, window frames, or fiddles with equal dexterity. He also made violoncellos, and was so fortunate as to sell one of his own making for 3 guineas, which is still reckoned a good instrument. He doubtless felt within him the promptings of ambition, such as every good workman feels, and at all events entertained the desire of rising in his trade. When his time was out, he accordingly resolved to seek work in London, whither he made the journey on foot. He soon found work at a cabinet maker's, and remained with him for some time, after which he set up in business in a very small way on his own account. An accident which happened to him in the course of his daily work again proved his helper, by affording him a degree of leisure which he at once proceeded to turn to some useful account. Part of his business consisted in putting up water closets, after a method invented or improved by Mr. Allen. But the article was still very imperfect, and Bramah had long resolved that if he could only secure some leisure for the purpose, he would contrive something that should supersede it altogether. A severe fall which occurred to him in the course of his business, and laid him up, though very much against his will, now afforded him the leisure which he desired, and he proceeded to make his proposed invention. He took out a patent for it in 1778, describing himself in the specification as "of Cross Court, Carnaby Market, Golden Square, Middlesex, cabinet maker." He afterwards removed to a shop in Denmark Street, St. Giles, and while there he made a further improvement to his invention by the addition of a watercock, which he patented in 1783. The merits of the machine were generally recognised, and before long it came into extensive use, continuing to be employed with but few alterations until the present day. His circumstances improving with the increased use of his invention, Bramah proceeded to undertake the manufacture of the pumps, pipes, etc., required for its construction, and remembering his friend the Yorkshire blacksmith, who had made his first tools for him out of old files and razor blades, he sent for him to London to take charge of the blacksmith's department, in which he proved a most useful assistant. As usual, the patent was attacked by pirates as soon as it became productive, and Bramah was under the necessity, on more than one occasion, of defending his property in the invention, in which he was completely successful. We next find Bramah turning his attention to the invention of a lock that should surpass all others then known. The locks then in use were of a very imperfect character, easily picked by dexterous thieves, against whom they afforded little protection. Yet locks are a very ancient invention, though, as in many other cases, the art of making them seems in a great measure to have become lost, and accordingly had to be found out anew. Thus the tumbler lock, which consists in the use of movable impediments acted on by the proper key only, as contradistinguished from the ordinary ward locks, where the impediments are fixed, appears to have been well known to the ancient Egyptians, the representation of such a lock being found sculpted among the bas reliefs which decorate the great temple at Karnak. This kind of lock was revived, or at least greatly improved, by a Mr. Barron in 1774, and it was shortly after this time that Bramah directed his attention to the subject. After much study and many experiments, he contrived a lock more simple, more serviceable, as well as more secure than Barron's, as is proved by the fact that it has stood the test of nearly 80 years' experience, and still holds its ground. For a long time, indeed, Bramah's lock was regarded as absolutely inviolable, and it remained unpicked for 67 years, until Hobbs the American mastered it in 1851. A notice had long been exhibited in Bramah's shop window in Piccadilly, offering £200 to anyone who could succeed in picking the patent lock. Many tried, and all failed, until Hobbs succeeded after 16 days' manipulation of it with various elaborate instruments. But the difficulty with which the lock was picked showed that, for all ordinary purposes, it might be pronounced impregnable. The new locks were machines of the most delicate kind, the action of which depended in a great measure upon the precision with which the springs, sliders, levers, barrels, and other parts were finished. The merits of the invention being generally admitted, there was a considerable demand for the locks, and the necessity thus arose for inventing a series of original machine tools to enable them to be manufactured in sufficient quantities to meet the demand. It is probable, indeed, that but for the contrivance of such tools, the lock could never have come into general use, as the skill of hand workmen, no matter how experienced, could not have been relied upon for the turning out of the article with that degree of accuracy finish in all the parts which was indispensable for its proper action. In conducting the manufacture throughout, Bramah was greatly assisted by Henry Maudslay, his foreman, to whom he was in no small degree indebted for the contrivance of those machine tools which enabled him to carry on the business of lock making with advantage and profit. Bramah's indefatigable spirit of invention was only stimulated to fresh efforts by the success of his locks, and in the course of a few years we find him entering upon a more important and original line of action than he had yet ventured on. His patent of 1785 shows the direction of his studies. Watt had invented his steam engine, which was coming into general use, and the creation of motive power in various other forms became a favourite subject of inquiry with inventors. Bramah's first invention with this object was his Hydrostatic Machine, founded on the doctrine of the equilibrium of pressure in fluids, as exhibited in the well-known hydrostatic paradox. In his patent of 1785, in which he no longer describes himself as cabinet maker, but engine maker of Piccadilly, he indicated many inventions, though none of them came into practical use, such as a hydrostatical machine and boiler, and the application of the power produced by them to the drawing of carriages, and the propelling of ships by a paddle wheel fixed in the stern of the vessel, of which drawings are annexed in the specification. but it was not until 1795 that he patented his hydrostatic or hydraulic press. Though the principle on which the hydraulic press is founded had long been known, and formed the subject of much curious speculation, it remained unproductive of results until a comparatively recent period, when the idea occurred of applying it to mechanical purposes. A machine of the kind was indeed proposed by Pascal, the eminent philosopher, in 1664, but more than a century elapsed before the difficulties in the way of its construction were satisfactorily overcome. Bramah's machine consists of a large and massive cylinder, in which there works an accurately fitted solid piston or plunger. A forcing pump of very small bore communicates with the bottom of the cylinder, and by the action of the pump handle or lever, exceedingly small quantities of water are forced in succession beneath the piston in the large cylinder, thus gradually raising it up and compressing bodies whose bulk or volume it is intended to reduce. Hence it is most commonly used as a packing press, being superior to every other contrivance of the kind that has yet been invented. And though exercising a prodigious force, it is so easily managed that a boy can work it. The machine has been employed on many extraordinary occasions in preference to other methods of applying power. Thus Robert Stephenson used it to hoist the gigantic tubes of the Britannia Bridge into their bed, and Brunel to launch the Great Eastern steamship from her cradles. It has also been used to cut bars of iron, to draw the piles driven in forming cofferdams, and to wrench up trees by the roots, all of which feats it accomplishes with comparative ease. The principal difficulty experienced in constructing the hydraulic press before the time of Bramah arose from the tremendous pressure exercised by the pump, which forced the water through between the solid piston and the sides of the cylinder in which it worked in such quantities as to render the press useless for practical purposes. Bramah himself was at first completely baffled by this difficulty. It will be observed that the problem was to secure a joint sufficiently free to let the piston slide up through it, and at the same time so watertight as to withstand the internal force of the pump. These two conditions seemed so conflicting that Bramah was almost at his wit's end, and for a time despaired of being able to bring the machine to a state of practical efficiency. None but those who have occupied themselves in the laborious and often profitless task of helping the world to new and useful machines can have any idea of the tantalizing anxiety which arises from the apparently petty stumbling blocks which for a while impede the realization of a great idea in mechanical invention. Such was the case with the watertight arrangement in the hydraulic press. In his early experiments, Bramah tried the expedient of the ordinary stuffing box for the purpose of securing the required watertightness. That is, a coil of hemp or leather washers was placed in a recess so as to fit tightly round the moving ram or piston, and it was further held in its place by means of a compressing collar forced hard down by strong screws. The defect of this arrangement was that, even supposing the packing could be made sufficiently tight to resist the passage of the water urged by the tremendous pressure from beneath, such was the grip which the compressed material took of the ram of the press that it could not be got to return down after the water pressure had been removed. In this dilemma, Bramah's ever-ready workman Henry Maudslay came to his rescue. The happy idea occurred to him of employing the pressure of the water itself to give the requisite water-tightness to the collar. It was a flash of common-sense genius, beautiful through its very simplicity. The result was Maudslay's self-tightening collar, the action of which a few words of description will render easily intelligible. A collar of sound leather, the convex side upwards and the concave side downwards, was fitted into the recess turned out in the neck of the press cylinder, at the place formerly used as a stuffing box. Immediately on the high-pressure water being turned on, it forced its way into the leathern concavity and flapped out the bent edges of the collar, and in so doing caused the leather to apply itself to the surface of the rising ram, with a degree of closeness and tightness so as to seal up the joint the closer exactly in proportion to the pressure of the water in its tendency to escape. On the other hand, the moment the pressure was let off and the ram desired to return, the collar collapsed and the ram slid gently down, perfectly free and yet perfectly watertight. Thus the former tendency of the water to escape by the side of the piston was, by this most simple and elegant self-adjusting contrivance, made instrumental to the perfectly efficient action of the machine, and from the moment of its invention the hydraulic press took its place as one of the grandest agents for exercising power in a concentrated and tranquil form. Bramah continued his useful labours as an inventor for many years. His study of the principles of hydraulics in the course of his invention of the press enabled him to introduce many valuable improvements in pumping machinery. By varying the form of the piston and cylinder, he was enabled to obtain a rotary motion, which he advantageously applied to many purposes. Thus he adopted it in the well-known fire engine, the use of which has become almost universal. Another popular machine of his is the beer pump, patented in 1797, by which the publican is enabled to raise from the casks in the cellar beneath the various liquors sold by him over the counter. He also took out several patents for the improvement of the steam engine, in which, however, Watt left little room for other inventors, and hence Bramah seems to have entertained a grudge against Watt, which broke out fiercely in the evidence given by him in the case of Boulton and Watt versus Hornblower and Maberly, tried in December 1796. On that occasion his temper seems to have got the better of his judgment, and he was cut short by the judge in the attempt which he then made to submit the contents of the pamphlet subsequently published by him in the form of a letter to the judge before whom the case was tried. In that pamphlet he argued that Watt's specification had no definite meaning, that it was inconsistent and absurd, and could not possibly be understood, that the proposal to work steam engines on the principle of condensation was entirely fallacious, that Watt's method of packing the piston was monstrous stupidity, that the engines of Newcomen, since entirely superseded, were infinitely superior in all respects to those of Watt. Conclusions which, we need scarcely say, have been refuted by the experience of nearly a century. On the expiry of Boulton and Watt's patent, Bramah introduced several valuable improvements in the details of the condensing engine, which had by that time become an established power, the most important of which was his four-way cock, which he so arranged as to revolve continuously instead of alternately, thus ensuring greater precision with considerably less wear of parts. In the same patent by which he secured this invention in 1801, he also proposed sundry improvements in the boilers, as well as modifications in various parts of the engine, with the object of effecting greater simplicity and directness of action. In his patent of 1802, we find Bramah making another great stride in mechanical invention in his tools for producing straight, smooth, and parallel surfaces on wood and other materials requiring truth, in a manner much more expeditious and perfect than can be performed by the use of axes, saws, planes, and other cutting instruments used by hand in the ordinary way. The specification describes the object of the invention to be the saving of manual labour, the reduction in the cost of production, and the superior character of the work executed. The tools were fixed on frames driven by machinery, some moving in a rotary direction round an upright shaft, some with the shaft horizontal like an ordinary wood-turning lathe, while in others the tools were fixed on frames sliding in stationary grooves. A wood-planing machine was constructed on the principle of this invention at Woolwich Arsenal, where it still continues in efficient use. The axis of the principal shaft was supported on a piston in a vessel of oil, which considerably diminished the friction, and it was so contrived as to be accurately regulated by means of a small forcing pump. Although the machinery described in the patent was first applied to working on wood, it was equally applicable to working on metals, and in his own shops at Pimlico, Bramah employed a machine with revolving cutters to plane the metallic surfaces for his patent locks and other articles. He also introduced a method of turning spherical surfaces, either convex or concave, by a tool movable on an axis perpendicular to that of the lathe, and of cutting out concentric shells by fixing in a similar manner a curved tool of nearly the same form as that employed by common turners for making bowls. In fact, says Mr. Mallet, Bramah not only anticipated but carried out upon a tolerably large scale in his own works, for the construction of the patent hydraulic press, the water closet, and his locks, a surprisingly large proportion of our modern tools. His remarkable predilection in favour of the use of hydraulic arrangements is displayed in his specification on the surface planing machinery, which includes a method of running pivots entirely on a fluid, and raising and depressing them at pleasure by means of a small forcing pump and stopcock, though we are not aware that any practical use has ever been made of this part of the invention. Bramah's inventive genius displayed itself alike in small things as in great, in a tap wherewith to draw a glass of beer, and in a hydraulic machine capable of tearing up a tree by the roots. His powers of contrivance seemed inexhaustible, and were exercised on the most various subjects. When any difficulty occurred which mechanical ingenuity was calculated to remove, recourse was usually had to Bramah, and he was rarely found at a loss for a contrivance to overcome it. Thus, when applied to by the Bank of England in 1806 to construct a machine for more accurately and expeditiously printing the numbers and date lines on bank notes, he at once proceeded to invent the requisite model, which he completed in the course of a month. He subsequently brought it to great perfection, the figures in numerical succession being changed by the action of the machine itself, and it still continues in regular use. Its employment in the Bank of England alone saved the labour of 100 clerks, but its chief value consisted in its greater accuracy, the perfect legibility of the figures printed by it, and the greatly improved check which it afforded. We next find him occupying himself with inventions connected with the manufacture of pens and paper. His little pen-making machine for readily making quill pens long continued in use until driven out by the invention of the steel pen, but his patent for making paper by machinery, though ingenious like everything he did, does not seem to have been adopted, the inventions of Fourdrinier and Donkin in this direction having shortly superseded all others. Among his other minor inventions may be mentioned his improved method of constructing and sledging carriage wheels, and his improved method of laying water pipes. In his specification of the last mentioned invention, he included the application of water power to the driving machinery of every description, and for hoisting and lowering goods in docks and warehouses, since carried out in practice, though in a different manner, by Sir William Armstrong. In this, as in many other matters, Bramah shot ahead of the mechanical necessities of his time, and hence many of his patents, of which he held at one time more than 20, proved altogether profitless. His last patent, taken out in 1814, was for the application of Roman cement to timber for the purpose of preventing dry rot. Besides his various mechanical pursuits, Bramah also followed to a certain extent the profession of a civil engineer, though his more urgent engagements rendered it necessary for him to refuse many advantageous offers of employment in this line. He was, however, led to carry out the new waterworks at Norwich between the years 1790 and 1793, in consequence of his having been called upon to give evidence in a dispute between the corporation of that city and the lessees, in the course of which he propounded plans which, it was alleged, could not be carried out. To prove that they could be carried out, and that his evidence was correct, he undertook the new works, and executed them with complete success, besides demonstrating, in a spirited publication elicited by the controversy, the insufficiency and incongruity of the plans which had been submitted by the rival engineer. For some time prior to his death, Bramah had been employed in the erection of several large machines in his works at Pimlico for sawing stone and timber, to which he applied his hydraulic power with great success. New methods of building bridges and canal locks, with a variety of other matters, were in an embryo state in his mind, but he did not live to complete them. He was occupied in superintending the action of his hydrostatic press at Holt Forest in Hants, where upwards of 300 trees of the largest dimensions were in a very short time torn up by the roots, when he caught a severe cold which settled upon his lungs, and his life was suddenly brought to a close on the 9th of December 1814, in his 66th year. His friend, Dr. Cullen Brown, has said of him that Bramah was a man of excellent moral character, temperate in his habits, and of a pious turn of mind, and so cheerful in temperament that he was the life of every company into which he entered. To much facility of expression he added the most perfect independence of opinion. He was a benevolent and affectionate man, neat and methodical in his habits, and knew well how to temper liberality with economy. Greatly to his honour, he often kept his workmen employed solely for their sake, when stagnation of trade prevented him disposing of the products of their labour. As a manufacturer he was distinguished for his promptitude and probity, and he was celebrated for the exquisite finish which he gave to all his productions. In this excellence of workmanship, which he was the first to introduce, he continued while he lived to be unrivalled. Bramah was deservedly honoured and admired as the first mechanical genius of his time, and as the founder of the art of tool-making in its highest branches. From his shops at Pimlico came Henry Maudslay, Joseph Clement, and many more first-class mechanics, who carried the mechanical arts to still higher perfection, and gave an impulse to mechanical engineering the effects of which are still felt in every branch of industry. The parish to which Bramah belonged was naturally proud of the distinction he had achieved in the world, and commemorated his life and career by a marble tablet erected by subscription in his memory in the parish church of Silkstone. In the churchyard are found the tombstones of Joseph's father, brother, and other members of the family, and we are informed that the descendants still occupy the farm at Stainborough on which the great mechanician was born. End of chapter 11.